I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll, the podcast exploring what makes great boards and board members. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Malcolm John, has dedicated his career to advancing racial equality at the highest levels of the charity sector. He's the founder of Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, a trustee at the Association of Chairs, the Charles Dickens Museum, and the British American Drama Company, among others. He also serves on the Ministry of Justice's Public Appointments Panel and chairs the induction panel at the Charity Hall of Fame. He is currently acting CEO of Board Racial Diversity UK. Previously, he has held leadership roles at organisations ranging from Anti-Slavery International to the Young Harrow Foundation to NACRO UK's leading crime reduction charity. We're talking today about racial diversity in the boardroom, not just why it matters, but what's holding us back and how we move forward. Whether you're a board member, chair, or aspiring trustee, this is a conversation with insights you won't want to miss. Malcolm, a huge welcome and thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be asked to do this podcast with you, Ollie, and it was so great to actually meet you recently after 5 years of our working together in person at the CMI Awards. So I'm delighted to be here.
Well, it was my pleasure to meet you in person. A very sort of strange thing having talked to you for so long online to actually be able to meet in person. Malcolm, can you start by sharing a bit about your own journey into the boardroom?
It's been a fairly unconventional journey. I'm currently on my probably 9th charity board, so a bit of a serial trustee. And largely that happened through my own personal contacts and my own networks, rather than the more formal approach which I'm now advocating as part of my work on racial diversity. And I can recall probably the first 3 charities I was involved with. The first came through, I think, somebody I used to play squash with, who went to university with the CEO of a social housing charity. And we went to the opera together, my first opera event, and I was working in government at the time on funding, on a grant funding program. And he happened to ask me whether I was interested in being a trustee. At that time, I'd only worked with charities, never within them. And so I didn't exactly know what I was being asked to do, but it sounded like an interesting gig and I knew them. So I said, yes, I would. And that was probably my first event. And then with NACRO, which you mentioned, and again, I was working with the National Grid Foundation at the time. I was in social policy advice. And we had funded a NACRO project in Birmingham. So I was traveling on the train with the then CEO of NACRO and happened to mention that I was already on a board and I didn't realize you were that gay, Malcolm, and asked whether I was interested in joining them as a trustee. And yeah, again, I don't say no often enough, and which is something I'm learning to do more and more. So yeah, and the interview for that, the chair at the time was actually a Lib Dem peer. And again, slightly unconventionally, the interview was actually in the House of Lords over tea, rather than the more formal interview which I'm now trying to promote. And so, yeah, so I had an odd start to my board career. And then since then, it's been again, when I joined Anti-Slavery International, the then the ex-chair treasurer of NACRO had moved to join Anti-Slavery International, and they were then looking for trustees. So he asked that I was interested in doing that. I'd never done any international development work before, but it sounded interesting. And like for me, a development opportunity. And so, yeah, again, another interview, again, in a rather totally unlike the House of Lords. It was at the CEO's office, crowned with papers, and not necessarily a good sign of best management, but it sounded like an interesting role. And so I signed up to that. And since then, yeah, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, but that's just a small insight. And I think I've enjoyed the chair roles and the vice chair roles that I've had. Certainly with NACRO as vice chair, and similarly with Anti-Slavery International. And I think that sort of gives you the joy of actually being able to lead and strategize for organizations and actually play a leading role. Because you find that very often when trustees join boards, they're not entirely sure what their specific role is. And unless you're a treasurer or chair or a vice chair, you're one among 8, 9, 10. And sometimes that voice can be lost. So again, I'm really keen that when people join boards, they give you specific responsibilities. And to move on to the work I'm doing now, which is, again, I founded actually with Trustee Racial Diversity, Ollie, as you know, 4 or 5 years ago. And yeah, as we were saying earlier, thought I wouldn't still be doing it now, but I am. And we became a formal charity at the end of last year. And that was part of my succession planning and exit strategy. But the exit is still a way off yet. So I'm still desperately working towards that.
Well, it's an amazing journey. And one of the things that jumped out at me there listening to you was that pattern playing out of you meeting people, having good conversations with them, and then them asking you to join the board, and the pattern of you being on someone's board and them asking you to join another board with them, which is always, I think, of a very good sign when someone's adding value. What do you think it was that you were doing in those situations that someone listening might learn from?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And the whole racial diversity aspect, I haven't picked up on that specifically. But largely, I've been the only Black or Asian person on those boards. Where there have been others, they've had to leave because of lack of inclusion or lack of acceptance. I guess I've been lucky that I've come from a background where I have the confidence to be that sole representative on the board. So I'm able to navigate that. And a lot of people can't. So I guess it is about that. I think I bring specific skills. So again, I brought skills in governance. I used to be a civil servant in a past life. So I understand the requirements of charity governance, of being a member of a committee, of chairing committees. So I think I bring that. And I also bring, I think, independence. As you know, I'm an independent member of the Ministry of Justice Public Appointments Unit. And again, I was asked to apply for that through a connection with the Association of Chairs. Again, a dinner, which I was at. And there was a director of one of the government departments. We were just chatting. And I think she felt that I could contribute to that particular organization. And I think I challenge things and don't accept the status quo. So I think it's that bit in particular, which I bring, and I'll give a different perspective. My own background is not the traditional older, white, retired, middle-class consultant or senior manager. Again, my background, I grew up in a housing estate in northwest London. We went to a state grammar school, was lucky enough to go on to university. And I bring that different experience to boards, which boards don't always say they welcome and value. But again, the whole thing around diversity is that you get so many different perspectives and so much untapped experiences, which boards should value so much more than they do. But again, for them, it's quite a tough ask to actually be comfortable about getting there. And when they do get there, not really knowing how to deal with that situation in an inclusive and sustainable way.
You talked about one of your unique factors as being having the confidence to navigate the boardroom. For someone listening who doesn't know what that means or how they get that. Can you expand?
Yeah, it is a good question. It's largely about relationships with people. It's about knowing why other people are in that boardroom. It's about knowing what skills, experience they might bring to that boardroom. It's recognizing that you're one of a team of 8, 9, 10. It's collegiate, but it's collegiate with a collection of individuals from a variety of perspectives. And I think when I've been on boards, again, because I've often known CEO or the chair, I've been able to be more comfortable joining that board. And I think if people are not in that position, then it's incumbent on the organization itself to ensure that happens. And with the Charles Dickens Museum, I think what appealed to me about that was, apart from being a lover of Charles Dickens, they have social events after each board meeting. They go out for a meal to get to know each other. Because otherwise you're attending 4 or 5 board meetings a year, couple of hours, and you'll never actually get to know the other people in any realistic way. So it's about how do you ensure that happens, giving people a body on boards so that there's somebody that they can talk to, an experienced trustee who can steer them through the ropes. And I think that's really important. But then not making that tokenistic so that it's not just a one-off and it's a proper dialogue between the body and the person who's being bodied, if that's a term I can use. So I think it's that understanding of the group dynamics, but also about the role that you also play in that group dynamic. So if you don't know what that role is, then you're going to feel uncomfortable in terms of when you speak up and when you don't speak up. I think each board is different. I'm trying to think of places where I've been on a board. I'm not quite sure about what my role has been. I think I've made pains to talk to the chair of boards I've been on and have a one-to-one with them. And I think with my new board, Racial Diversity UK, I have co-chairs and they and I meet regularly every 6 weeks, often in person, just to talk through the issues and to get to know each other. And it's something that I want to do with individual trustees as well. There's finding time to do that, which isn't always easy.
So if I play back that, I heard a few different things that really jumped out at me. So one was around creating those opportunities for someone to build that one-on-one relationship so that when you look around the board table and you're making that challenging point, there's someone there who's smiling at you, who knows, who doesn't make you feel like you're doing something wrong is key. And doing that by that second point is around creating those opportunities where it's easy to do that, where it's organization-led and not leaving you as the individual to have to catalyze those sorts of relationships. And then the last point I really liked was this sense of the importance of understanding your role and why you're there. For someone listening to this, trying to get a grasp and think about, well, why would I be there? Can you bring that to life with a few examples of some of how you have thought about why you are there on different boards and to what extent that's varied across different boards?
If I look at the Charles Dickens Museum that I've just joined and also the British American Drama Academy, I've joined those 2 boards because I'm interested in arts and culture, and so in theatre and in literature. And I grew up in reading Charles Dickens. I love going to America, so I love going to California, watching American drama series. So things about that appeal to me. I bring that passion to what those boards are about. But that sector is probably notoriously not that good at good governance. Looking around the current board members on those boards, there's actually limited experience of governance or of EDI issues. So I know that's something that I will bring specifically to those boards. It hasn't been unchallenging because it's not a discussion that they've necessarily had because of the makeup of the existing trustees and the chairs. The challenge for me is to, again, not be seen as being the one person who does the EDI on the board. And it's about the boards seeing it as an organizational issue and something that would add real value to organization. So my role would be sharing my own knowledge and insights in that area so that other people actually are a part of that team and a part of the solution, and it's not just me. And it's often going back to square one on the organizations and asking the question themselves in terms of how representative is that board of the people that they support.
I really like that. I suppose the challenge for someone listening to this who's perhaps thinking about taking on their first board role, of that first thing you talked about there, your role as a governance guru, is, it's okay for someone like you who's been on loads of boards, but for someone who's just starting out, they can't be that person. Whereas for anyone listening, they can be the person who represents the voice of the institution, depending on what the institution is and depending on where they come from. So that feels like it should be open to anyone. Are there any caveats to that? Is that sufficient?
When I was recruiting for new charity, we spelt out the skills we were looking for. So skills around technology, around social media, around EDI, around working with young people. And so we put out a pretty inclusive ad saying we're looking for people who have those skills, because as a new charity, we know that's where the gaps are. So we make sure that we don't just bring people on because of the colour of their skin or because of their age, and because that it also comes with skills. And it's then about ensuring that those skills, again, they inform the strategy, then they inform our operations. And that, again, when we do have board meetings where those areas are being discussed, that largely the chair or the trustees ensure that voice is being heard. So, I think it's very much skills-based for me. And also it's about not being the only person who has those skills or has that characteristic. Again, my advice is always to boards to say, don't just recruit for tokenistic elements. Recruit 2 or 3 Black or Asian trustees with a variety of skills. Recruit 2 or 3 young people with a variety of skills. Because actually, it's quite tough when you're joining a board who doesn't look like you. He's not your age, he's not your gender, he's not your sexuality. It's quite difficult to try and find that common ground.
You have obviously enjoyed the role of being on boards. You've done lots of them. What have been the lowlights on the journey?
Yeah, I think I've been lucky enough, Ollie, to not have very many lowlights, or perhaps I've just brushed them under the carpet in a very optimistic way. The worst thing that I see at board meetings is you're inundated with numbers and papers and words, and you can't get to the nub of your role and what the charity is about and what are the key risks in running that charity. So I think there needs to be a balance struck between how much a trustee can ensure that their accountability role is maintained. So how much information do they need from the executive team? There are some trustees who would relish a whole lot of information, others who wouldn't, because we all work in different ways. But I think there needs to be a proper discussion about that, which often doesn't happen at board meetings. There's an assumption that this is how we've always done it, let's carry on doing that. And when your on board is changing, different people, different levels of history and of knowledge, for me, every board must start with that discussion about, are we going about this the right way? Is there too much paper? Is there too much talk about the operations? Is there enough blue sky thinking? So I think it's that open discussion, I think, has to start. And once I think you set that proportionate framework, then I think you can start talking about accountability. But it is about whether there should be perhaps a different model of governance, which is perhaps more linear. And I think what I'm looking at within my own organisation is that more collective responsibility, which is more skills-based. So you might be a trustee, you might actually bring operational skills, so which you might bring to contributing in subcommittees or working groups. So I guess it is about rethinking the role. For me, I think the traditional charity role is probably outdated. When you start to get more diverse, younger trustees who actually may be in full-time jobs, doing consultancy work, have care responsibilities, you need to start to think about how do you engage that sort of person in a way that they can contribute and not feel isolated or left out of the decision making. I think there's a discussion which is just starting around that, and the association of chairs have done some recent survey around that. It's a long overdue discussion that I'm really keen to play whatever parts I can myself in that.
I'm interested going back to your sort of, how do you stay on top of things? And you talk there about spending a couple of days. And I've never sat in a trustee role. I've only ever held commercial board roles. But one of the penny drop moments for me was when I moved from being an investor director into being an operator and scaling this organization as the CEO, was that as an investor director, it was very easy to buy into the executive narrative. And you had the image of the organization as presented by the CEO and the senior execs. But then actually, once you're in as an operator with your sleeves rolled up, and I think I was sort of getting better at this as an investor director, of going and spending time in the business, often it's like it's a tale of two cities. And I think many board members don't spend enough time on the ground. There is no substitute for that. And if you're only reliant on those board papers and you're not spending enough time in the organization, then you can never do the job properly.
Yeah. I like the Charles Dickens analogy, by the way.
I thought you might.
I won't say hard times, but yeah, it's just about the time people have to spend. So as a crazy instance, I was asked to work with a national organization quite recently, and they asked whether I could attend a meeting at 7:30 in the morning of their recruitment committee. Well, I haven't seen 7:30 for a long time, I have to say, Ollie. So I was slightly taken aback, and I was amused as to why on earth they were having what regular, it was 7:30 to 8:30 nominations committee meetings. And they also had them in the evenings as well. And I gather it was actually a young person's organization. I won't say which one it is, but I presume it's because it's suited the members of those groups. So it's just about having that conversation with individuals as to how they could best contribute in a way that suits their personal circumstances. But the whole thing about trustees are not paid. So, if you're a self-employed young person, you haven't got the luxury of spending that amount of time unless you're paid, unless you're compensated for it. But I think I agree with the principle of being able to do that to understand the business, but which means having to change the whole model of trusteeship.
Can we zoom out a bit and talk a little bit about the work that you've done with Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, where one of the things you highlighted was that only 8% of UK charities from Black and global majority or racially diverse backgrounds, despite these groups making up approximately 14% of the population. What's your sort of latest data on that? And what does it suggest about the current state of racial diversity on charity boards?
And I think that's sort of my exit strategy, where when we actually achieve that proportionate representation on it. The figures I've worked out in terms of how many more Black and Asian trustees are needed to bridge that gap is 40,000 more additional Black and Asian trustees. So that's quite a lot of people. But if you break it down, if each charity recruited 2 of those trustees, we're talking about 20,000 charities, which is as a percentage, it's about 12% of charities in the UK. So it's not unachievable, but it requires a lot of stuff that we're addressing to achieve that. The figures you just quoted are taken from the Charity Commission Taking on Trust report, which was a survey of diversity, which came out in 2017. There's been no update on that since, which is 7 years ago, 8 years. But I do know the Charity Commission are doing some work with pro bono economics to bring out and some more stats, I think quite soon, this year. So it'll be interesting to see what that says. I don't think there'll be a huge shift from that 8%. And even underpinning that 8%, there's women of colour is only 3%. So that is even more shocking if you're a woman from a Black or Asian background. And until we change informal recruitment of trustees. That figure will be fairly stagnant because, again, as long as most trustees are older white male and they recruit from older white male networks, then that will keep that status quo. So trustees have to move much more towards formal recruitment and open recruitment and going out to more diverse networks and engaging those more diverse networks in a way that appeals to them. It's changing slowly. The work I'm doing, the work that I'm getting on board have done, the Young Trustees movement are doing work there, but I think there's still quite a long way to go. Charity Commission perhaps could do more to apply conditions more in the annual reports that all charities must report on what they're doing on EDI and on their recruitment practices, which they're not incumbent to do. But it's not a quick fix. It takes a long time. And it also needs a change in the leadership. Because I think, as we've said, the chairs, co-chairs have such a key role. They set the tone, they set the culture, they recruit the CEOs and executive team. So unless they address that lack of inclusiveness, that lack of equity, you're never ever going to get that sustainable change. And then one of the initiatives that we've developed is called BAFCA. Going back to my arts and drama, it's the Black and Asian Future Chairs Academy. So it's short of BAFCA, not BAFTA. We're, again, much more diverse than they are at the moment. And that's about developing a pipeline of Black and Asian future leaders. Because, again, most people in those circumstances don't see chair as being a role for them. They don't feel as if they'll join a board that supports them. The board role often doesn't suit their circumstances. So I think, again, there's a way to build up momentum and to let people who wouldn't traditionally think about applying for a chair think, actually, I could do a co-chair role because actually I bring that lived experience. And also I won't be alone. I'll be supported by perhaps a more experienced co-chair. My co-chairs, Dalton and Lena, come from different backgrounds, different experiences, but they share the same values and they respect each other enormously, and it works.
I'm really interested to hear your perspective on one of the challenges that I see organizations wrestling with when they are trying to improve the diversity of their boards is two factors. One, and these are specific to the UK, but in the UK, well, across the whole population, I think in the 2021 census, around 18% of the population who are from Black and global majority racially diverse backgrounds. But if you break it down by age, it's 24% of under 40-year-olds, but only 13% of over 40. So there's this massive age dynamic involved. And then the other one is the geographic dynamic, which is in London, it's only 37% of the population are white British, while in most of the rest of the UK, it's 80 to 90%. So there are these, I think people often talk about averages, but I'm always reminded of the person who drowned in the river that was on average only 2 inches deep. The averages can be misleading because there might be a bit somewhere in the middle which is actually 12 feet deep. And it's just a very wide river. So really curious to hear how you think about that age and geographic dynamic for, say, a charity maybe that's based outside of London. That is, do they need to be looking for people with less experience because they're younger?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think representation is the key. It's about having voices which represent the people, organizations that you support. I've been working with a charity last year based in Norwich. They approached me to say they're looking for more diverse trustees, but actually in that area of the country, there isn't necessarily a high proportion of people in Black and Asian background. Interesting enough, when I researched the census stats, there's actually more than they think, but they're maybe more scattered. And I think the places, the university towns, for instance, you have a high portion of diverse students and such like. So there's more than people think, but actually it's harder to reach them because they're not as dense. So I think it's identifying how far you need to go to represent that particular population. And I think certainly with the age, again, if you're looking for a younger age group, then actually it makes a lot of sense for organizations to be looking among Black and Asian communities, because actually they look at significantly younger. I think some stats that I saw. So the highest median age for white ethnic groups was 43 years, and for mixed ethnic groups is 19 years. So that's quite an important strategy looking for younger trustees. And so the figure 14% in London is negligible, and it ought to be so much more. But I've been working with organisations in Bristol, Birmingham, Hackney, who've come to me and said, Malcolm, we can't find Black and Asian people as trustees in areas with high concentrations of those communities. And it's because they don't operate socially or professionally in their circles. So they don't know how to contact and how to reach. And I guess that's why, again, organisations like ours can actually advise them on how to do that. Finding volunteers and reach volunteers are brilliant source, particularly for younger, more diverse volunteers. So actually are getting reach volunteers to do that legwork for them. So they're actually speaking in a language that actually people who are not the traditional trustees can more easily understand.
Can you share what you've seen as the most common mistakes made by boards when they're in trying to improve the ethnic diversity on their board?
I think the most common mistakes are just looking to recruit somebody because of the colour of their skin. So not starting from, we need this particular skill or expertise on the board. We need to draw those skills and expertise from a richer, more diverse, untapped pool. So I think that's largely it. And people thinking that if they can attract one Black or Asian person, irrespective of their skills on the board, then actually the job is done. There was one particular individual. She was on a board outside London. It was in the stockbroker belt, and she was the only ethnic diversity person on that board. She had lots of ideas on how to improve the way the board was operating, both strategically and in terms of its diversity, but she wasn't listened to by the older, large white members of the board. She was also younger. So again, going back to what we were saying earlier, she was almost a lone, isolated voice on that board. She joined the board thinking that she could make a difference. It was a cause that she believed in, but she probably hadn't checked it out. So she had checked out as to if any red flags as to how far, when she did join, the board would have inclusive processes and policies in place, whether they'd actually discuss the whole thing about if somebody does join, how do we make sure that they stay? And so I think she was keen to stay on to justify the fact that she was on that board. And I think it affected her mental health, her well-being. And eventually, after much longer than I would have liked her to stay, she left and hopefully was looking forward to finding a safer and more inclusive environment.
It'd be really interesting because I'm sure that I can imagine some board members listening saying, well, maybe they didn't understand what the role of the board was, and failing the sort of Stephen Covey test of seek first to understand and then be understood. I could be really interested to understand what was it that this person was trying to do and what was the board's response? Did they just dismiss it out of hand?
Not party to the full detail of that, I have to say. So I'm not sure that I could give a proper answer to that, Ollie. I don't think they dismissed it out of hand. I just thought that it hadn't been something that they had thought about. So they were probably stuck in the way that they've always been doing stuff. And perhaps even resented the fact that somebody was coming in and saying, can we do things in a different way? And actually, I know that, I've been on boards where I think I've suggested that we do new things, we look at how we're doing things, and it takes time to overcome that resistance to change. And sometimes in those instances, I backed off because I don't think that there'll be any traction. I'm trying to think more specifically of what's actually happened when I've tried to do that. I've got a really good example with a board I joined, and they had a finance and operations committee, which was a key board committee. And that was populated by older white trustees. And for them, it was a power thing about that. That's where the power lied in that decision-making process. And I was actually in charge of the nominations, not where I like, the recruitment committee. And it was suggested that I could attend that finance and ops committee as the chair of the recruitment committee, but only as the chair, not as a full member. And which I found ridiculous. And they somehow didn't seem to understand that I felt as if I was being excluded from that committee for whatever reason, and that they had decided who would be on that committee, and any change would not be allowed to happen. So, yeah, and I just think that they were just in that mold of
What was their
not being
rationale
challenged.
that they offered for that?
There wasn't any rationale offered, I have to say.
Did you say, what's the rationale? And they just said, well, it is what it is? Or
Yeah, I think essentially that is what they said. They said the committee has now been set up. It was set up a while ago. It's got X number of members, and we're happy for you to attend. I had discussions with the chair around that, who eventually left. But I just think for them, it was their lack of understanding of inclusion and EDI. And they didn't see it as being the problem. And they just thought, oh, well, I'm sure it's fine. I'm sure as long as you come along and talk to it, Malcolm, that's fine. But they didn't see it from my perspective that I could add value to it, something that I was keen to be on. But they just saw it as being their power base, their decision-making base. And perhaps they thought that I would be upsetting the apple cart as a new member of it.
So they said you couldn't come along and talk at it?
And they were happy that I could talk on it, but not be a formally constituted member of it, so they'll not attend every meeting a normal member.
Why does that matter?
I think it matters to me because it gives an inkling of the culture of the organization, that it's not open to new ideas, and where it is open to new people, it becomes tokenistic. And so they were happy for me to join the board as a trustee, but actually they felt they needed to have a more diverse board. But they didn't really think much about the role and added value that I could play on that board, because they hadn't had any depth of conversation about what a more inclusive organization would look like and how it would benefit the organization. And I think, again, one of my favorite quotes is a guy called Walter Lippmann, who's an American political commentator you probably know. It's a quote around groupthink, which says, when all men think alike, then no one thinks very much. And for me, that captures the state of thinking on lots of boards where they're set there's a mindset about how they operate and change. And any board thinking about being more diverse must think about how they themselves will change to embrace and sustain more diverse individuals who are joining that organization. I think the issue was probably in a lack of clarity. And I think I probably presumed, Ollie, that when I was asked to attend, that it would be as a former member of that group and not as somebody attending in an ad hoc capacity. So I think I had that in mind.
So there's a sort of messaging that you felt like sort of not valued as much as the others around the table because of the symbolism of not having the same title.
Yeah, so I don't really know what their thinking was, to be honest. It wasn't a thinking that I felt at one with. About value, I guess, and I guess it wasn't just about me, it was about how they would then treat and consider and gain the trust of people who were not like them if they behave in that way. Another example, again, was there was a young black trustee, actually a lawyer, And he wasn't able to attend. He had a high pressurized job. He wasn't able to attend often the meetings. Getting back to our earlier discussion about how do you maximize people's time. And no real attempt was made to accommodate that. And he was actually given a relatively minor safeguarding role, which was because he was young. It was a young person organization. He was young, and they thought, okay, he could have taken on that safeguarding role. But it was really a tokenistic gesture, in my opinion. And I think a lot more should have been done to have that discussion with him about how and where, again, that's a conversation earlier, he could have played and can still play a more effective role within the board and within the organization.
I'm fascinated by that example because if someone with your experience in the boardroom, it sounds like you didn't feel comfortable voicing. And I don't know, but I wonder whether the rest of the board realised that. So it sounds like you're not sure if they did either. If they're listening to this, and if others are listening to this thinking, gosh, I wonder whether I've got a situation similar to that on my board where there's an issue that no one's voicing, what advice could you give to that person listening that would help them? What advice could that board have taken that would have helped them surface this issue?
No, it's really good insight, Ollie. Eventually, I did have a discussion with the now left chair about how I felt about that. And I guess I could have done that earlier. There's an issue again about which battles you fight. And it can be quite draining to be continually having those conversations. And then to my example earlier, might it be better just to say enough's enough? So I guess it's about how strong, robust, resilient, all those terms, you feel about picking up something like that.
That's really powerful. For me, my takeaway from that is don't be quick to assume a small thing is a small thing for someone else and have the courage to stand up when you see a small thing and check that it is really a small thing and get those assumptions explicit around the table. Malcolm, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round where I'm going to say a quick question and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Okay, yep.
Best book every board member should read and why?
Well, I have to say, my own guide, of course, which is called From Here to Diversity, which came out a couple of years ago, advising on how to recruit Black and Asian charity trustees. But that aside, there's a great book by Karen Bradshaw called It's a Nightmare with Numbers, which is about navigating finance on trustee boards. Finance figures are often the bane of boards of trustees who think it's not for them, but actually it's for everybody. So I would recommend that people get hold of that book, just to understand that finance is not rocket science and you can contribute to those discussions as well as anybody else can.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
I think it's when people clearly haven't read the papers and they sit there for 2 hours not saying a word and then might ask perhaps one question which quite clearly indicates that they have not read the board papers.
Most valuable board ritual?
I love the idea of going out for a meal after each board meeting, which Charles Dickens has now done.
Favourite quote?
Well, I've given you my favourite quote already. So it's when all men think alike, then no one thinks very much.
Most significant professional insight? Trust.
It's about how to gain trust, because actually with trust becomes a much better, effective way of working and communicating with people.
What's one assumption people make about racial diversity in the boardroom that you'd challenge?
The one we often hear is that person is the EDI expert and represents every Black or Asian person in the country. And that is clearly a nonsense, because they would be on there because they bring skills, talents and perspectives, which are individual to them.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think our discussion earlier about governance, which I know you subscribe to, it's outdated, and we now need to look at a better way of managing accountability on boards.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
For me, the 3 big things are that diversity is not a quick fix. It takes much longer than people think it will take. That diversity adds real organizational value and challenge and progression to organizations. And the third, again, that there's a huge and untapped pool of skills, talents, and passion within Black and Asian communities across England and Wales.
Malcolm, it's been a pleasure catching up. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Thanks, Roy. I really enjoyed it. The time has flown past. And do ask me again in a year's time when hopefully I'd have done my exit strategy by then and would have so much more to share.